Samuel Sam Bennett stood alone in the vast Dakota Territory, his boots sinking into the soft, rolling prairie as he surveyed the land that would become his homestead. It was the summer of 1880, and the wind had yet to bring the chill of winter, but Sam felt a subtle change in the air. He had worked 3 years in the lumber camps of Wisconsin, hauling wood through the snow and bitter winds, learning how to build for the cold that could freeze a man in his tracks. The land here, stretching in every direction, was vast, unforgiving, and to most eyes, harshly beautiful. But Sam had seen the worst of winter, and he knew the Dakota plains weren't kind to those who weren't prepared. He had a plan, one that would take time, patience, and a whole lot of sweat. His neighbors, however, didn't understand. "Why are you wasting all that wood?" they asked, laughing behind his back as he spent the late summer building a cabin that seemed, in their eyes, unnecessary. A cabin twice the size of the standard homesteader's shelter, built with care, precision, and thick hand-picked logs that would last a lifetime. The others worked quickly, barely taking time to notch the logs properly, their cabins thrown together in a rush. They saw the approaching winter as just another seasonal shift, something to endure like the last. But Sam knew better. He'd spent winters in Wisconsin as a boy, where the cold was not just an inconvenience, but a killer. When winter arrived in the mountains, it would lock in the snow and wind, freezing the unprepared and unprotected. Sam had seen firsthand the fate of those who rushed, building shelters for speed rather than survival. He couldn't afford to make the same mistake. His cabin was to be a fortress, built for the coldest, most brutal winter he could imagine. As he worked, he listened to the mocking words of his neighbors, how slow he was, how foolish he was to invest so much time in a cabin when he should be out on the land, plowing fields and planting crops. But he ignored them. He could hear the stories from Wisconsin, where men froze to death in poorly built shanties. He had lived through the horror of it, and he was determined not to repeat it. Each log he selected was more than just wood. It was a decision for his survival. Thick, heavy, and perfectly straight, each piece would form the walls of a cabin that would stand against any storm. The logs were stripped of their bark before being laid down, for he knew that bark could invite rot, and rot could mean death. He was careful with each joint, chiseling it precisely, ensuring that no gaps would remain to let in the wind or cold. This cabin would have double-thick walls, a rare decision, one that had his neighbors shaking their heads. But for Sam, the effort was simple. Build for the worst and hope to be wrong. As the summer passed and the days grew shorter, Sam worked tirelessly. His clothes were worn thin with use, his hands calloused and blistered. But the cabin began to take shape, its structure solid and reliable. His neighbors continued to mock, but each time they passed, their tone grew quieter, their eyes less certain. By September, the cabin was nearly complete, and the whispers about Sam Bennett had turned into quiet admiration. They had underestimated him, and they would come to regret it. Because the winter of 1856 was coming, and it would be one that no one could have anticipated. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, the first signs of the coming winter began to creep in across the Dakota Territory. Sam Bennett worked steadily on his cabin, unaware of the growing whispers in town. Farmers, ranchers, and homesteaders began exchanging worried looks and speaking in hushed tones. It was late October when they first felt it. The air was sharper, the wind colder. The year of 1856 was about to test the limits of what anyone had imagined. There had been rumors, circulating through the small settlement for weeks, quiet warnings from old-timers who'd seen more winters than any of the younger folks. The cattlemen, whose herds had grazed the plains for years, began talking about a cold snap unlike anything they had experienced before. The whispers were soon confirmed when, one evening, the first blizzard of the season arrived earlier than anyone expected. The snow began falling in soft, delicate flakes, barely noticeable at first. But by the following morning, it had piled up in thick drifts across the land, as if the plains themselves had been blanketed by a heavy, silent shroud. Sam paused his work and stepped outside, feeling the sharp sting of the wind as it whipped through his coat and chilled his bones. There was something different about this storm. It wasn't just a regular winter snowfall. The temperature plummeted far faster than he anticipated, and the wind carried a biting cold that seemed to cut right through the layers of his clothing. The next few days brought more snow, and the temperature continued to drop. What started as an early-season flurry turned into a full-fledged blizzard, a storm that blanketed the land and trapped the settlers in their homes. Sam knew that this was just the beginning. The worst was still to come. As the wind howled outside, Sam worked on finishing the final touches of his cabin. He'd already built the stone foundation and double-thick walls, lined the roof with layers of sod, and ensured that every joint and gap was sealed. While his neighbors huddled inside their smaller, hastily built shelters, struggling to keep warm, Sam continued to work with quiet determination. He had always known the winter could be harsh, but seeing it unfold firsthand was another matter entirely. By mid-November, the first real signs of hardship began to appear. The railroad crews stopped running trains due to the deepening snowdrifts, and the town's stores began to run low on supplies. Without the trains, the settlers would be cut off from the outside world, and any food they had would have to last the winter. Most cabins were built for just the usual cold snap, not for a brutal season that seemed to have no end. The townspeople began to feel the weight of the storm as it continued to rage. Many started to realize they hadn't prepared enough. Supplies were running low, firewood was scarce, and the biting cold seemed to seep into everything. Sam, however, was still warm inside his cabin. He sat by the fire, listening to the howling wind outside, confident in the strength of his construction. Wool layers, carefully chosen and worn under his coat, kept him comfortable despite the storm. As he gazed out the window, he could see the snow piling up against the cabin's walls, but he knew his shelter would hold. As the blizzards continued to pour across the plains, Sam Bennett worked quietly inside his cabin, unaware of the chaos unfolding just beyond his door. The storms grew fiercer, the snow deeper, and the temperature colder with each passing day. It was mid-November, and the once dismissed warning signs of a hard winter were no longer whispers. The reality had set in. Outside, the other settlers were beginning to struggle. Their hastily constructed cabins were already showing signs of strain, the thin walls unable to block the biting cold and wind. Some had crude lean-tos or small one-room cabins built in a rush, hoping to quickly settle into the land. They thought they had the advantage, a quick, cheap shelter that would see them through the winter. But as the storms intensified, it became clear that those quick fixes wouldn't suffice. Shutters froze shut, door frames warped, and the cold crept in through every crack. Sam's neighbors, who had mocked his deliberate pace all summer, now found themselves trapped by the very cold they had underestimated. Jasper Callahan, a neighbor living 2 miles down the road, had built his cabin in a hurry, cutting corners where Sam had carefully measured and planned. The first storm exposed the flaws in Jasper's structure. His single thick walls didn't stand a chance against the wind, and his modest fireplace couldn't keep up with the dropping temperatures. By the second week of November, he was running low on firewood, and the cold in his cabin became unbearable. Fool's Cabin, they called it. Jasper and his wife, Evelyn, huddled by the meager fire, both of them worried, even afraid. It wasn't the first time that winter that they'd questioned their quick decisions. Now they watched helplessly as the snow piled up against their door, trapped in a cold and fragile home. Jasper had stopped by Sam's cabin a few times during the early weeks of the storm, once to offer help and once simply to share a drink. He was quieter now, his usual bravado replaced by a nervous energy that matched the wind howling outside. "Should have listened," Jasper muttered one evening when he knocked on Sam's door. "Couldn't imagine this much snow so early, and these winds, by God, they've never stopped." Sam smiled faintly, standing aside to let him in. The warmth from the fire greeted him instantly, a comfort the Callahans had lacked. "It's all about being ready, Jasper. It's not about speed, it's about survival," Sam replied, tossing another log onto the fire. Jasper didn't argue. The mocking comments he'd made earlier in the year felt like distant memories, replaced by a new understanding. His cabin, built for speed, was now a constant battle against nature. The difference was clear. Sam's cabin stood firm against the storm, while Jasper's seemed to crumble under its weight. Jasper stayed the night, and by morning the cold outside seemed a little less menacing. Sam, though, knew the worst was yet to come. The wind howled through the night, its cold bite like a vengeful force that seemed to target every crack and crevice. By the time morning light broke across the snowy plains, the storm had worsened, and the full force of the winter was undeniable. Sam Bennett awoke to the sounds of the wind rattling his cabin's sturdy walls, but inside he was warm. His fire burned steady in the stone hearth, and the thick wool layers he wore kept him comfortable despite the harsh conditions outside. Sam stepped outside briefly, letting the cold air nip at his face before returning to the shelter of his home. The snow had already accumulated in deep drifts, and the world around him was buried in a blanket of white. But his cabin stood firm, unyielding to the elements. The double-thick walls, the carefully chinked logs, and the sod roof all performed as he had hoped. His preparations had paid off. Meanwhile, in the neighboring cabins, the effects of the storm were already apparent. The Callahans, along with the other settlers in the area, had been struggling. Their smaller cabins, built in haste and with little consideration for the worst of the cold, were beginning to show their weaknesses. Jasper Callahan had returned to his cabin early that morning, exhausted from battling the elements outside. He had trudged through the snow with a bundle of firewood, but it wasn't enough. The wind had stripped away much of the heat from his fire, and the cold seeped through the walls. Evelyn had wrapped herself in all the blankets they had, and even then she shivered uncontrollably. Jasper stared at the flickering fire in their modest hearth, frustration written on his face. His cabin was holding out, but just barely. His decision to rush construction, to cut corners in the name of time and efficiency, had placed them in a perilous situation. The cabin's single-thick walls could barely keep out the wind, and the makeshift chinking had failed to form a solid seal. "I should have listened to Sam," he muttered to himself, his eyes hollow with regret. Meanwhile, Sam Bennett continued to monitor the storm from his own cabin. He knew it would test everything. But what he hadn't expected was how quickly his neighbors would begin to falter. The storm had been the first real test of winter, and it had already revealed the truth. Some would survive, but others would pay the price for their hasty decisions. Sam kept the fire burning brightly inside his cabin, stoking it carefully while making sure the air in the room stayed fresh. He knew that when the storm passed, it would be the start of a long, grueling winter. His own firewood was plentiful, and the sawdust insulation between the double walls would help retain heat. But he couldn't help but feel a quiet sorrow for his neighbors. The storm raged on for days, the worst of the winter settling over the land. Yet, in the warmth of his cabin, Sam felt ready. He had built for the worst, and it seemed the worst had finally come. By late December, the brutal cold had become a constant presence in the Dakota Territory. The snow, now piled several feet high, blanketed the land in a thick, unforgiving layer. The temperature rarely rose above zero, and the wind howled ceaselessly, carrying with it a sharp, biting chill that seemed to freeze anything it touched. Sam Bennett's cabin stood strong, its thick double walls holding back the worst of the cold. He had spent the past weeks ensuring his firewood stores were well stocked, but he knew the worst was far from over. The storm that had started in November had escalated into something much worse. The town, once lively with settlers preparing for the harvest, was now a ghost of its former self. The nearby railway had stopped operating weeks ago, and now the settlers were cut off from outside help. Any provisions they had left were quickly running out. Word spread that food supplies were dangerously low, and some had even begun to ration their firewood. Sam had heard that one of his neighbors, Peter Johnson, had been struggling. Peter's cabin was another hastily built structure, its walls thin and poorly insulated. His wife, sick with pneumonia, and his 3 children, showing signs of frostbite, had been holed up for days, hoping for the storm to pass. One evening, as the wind howled louder than ever, Sam was working near his hearth when he heard a knock at the door. The sound was muffled by the storm, but it was unmistakable. Sam opened the door cautiously, half expecting to find another desperate settler looking for shelter. Standing in the doorway was Peter Johnson, his face drawn with exhaustion and his eyes wide with fear. Behind him, on a sled, was his wife, wrapped in blankets, and his children huddled together, too weak to stand. Sam's heart sank as he took in the sight. The family had made it halfway to town, but the storm had proved too much. "Sam, I don't know how much longer she'll last." Peter's voice cracked as he spoke. "I need help, please." Without hesitation, Sam stepped aside, urging Peter and Drake, his family, inside. The warmth from the fire greeted them immediately, a stark contrast to the bitter cold they had left outside. Sam wasted no time. He set up a place for Peter's wife in his bed, covering her with extra blankets, while the children were tucked near the fire. Sam moved quickly, using his remaining food supplies to make a simple broth, hoping to restore some strength to the children. His wool layers, snug against the cold, kept him warm as he worked. The storm outside raged, but inside, Sam felt the weight of his choices settle more deeply on his shoulders. Peter thanked him repeatedly, but Sam only nodded. He had built his cabin for moments like this for survival, not just for himself, but for anyone who needed help. In that quiet, desperate moment, Sam's preparations had saved more than just his own life. The storm raged on for weeks, and with each passing day, the settlers in the area found themselves more isolated, their resources dwindling. Sam Bennett had watched as the harsh conditions pushed his neighbors to the brink, and he felt a quiet responsibility for those who had turned to him for help. Peter Johnson's family had stayed with him for several days, their health improving slowly but steadily. The warmth of Sam's cabin, combined with the steady supply of food and a roof that didn't leak, had given them a fighting chance. For Peter, though, it wasn't just the warmth of the fire or the food that had made the difference. It was Sam's meticulous preparations, the wool layers he wore, the double-thick walls, and the insulation between them. All of it contributed to a survival strategy that his neighbors now understood. Peter had begun to see Sam's decision to build for the worst, to layer each piece of construction and clothing with care, as the key to enduring the winter that had, so far, shown no mercy. One evening, after the children were settled in bed and the storm outside had begun to subside, Peter sat down, with Sam by the fire. He had questions now, questions he hadn't asked before, when he'd thought the weather would be manageable. "Sam, I've been meaning to ask, how did you know? How did you know this winter would be different?" Sam stirred the fire with a poker, sending a few sparks into the dark. "I didn't know for sure, but I've seen winters before, the kind that don't let up, that keep you guessing. I've worked in the lumber camps of Wisconsin, where winters would freeze a man to the bone before he even saw the danger coming." Peter nodded, listening intently. "I see now what you meant. I rushed through everything, built what I thought was enough. I never even thought about the layers of the walls or the clothes. I thought I could get by with just a little protection, but it wasn't enough. Your wool layers, Sam, they kept you warm, even when the cold was unbearable." Sam looked over at Peter. "It's not just about wool, it's about thinking ahead. Layering isn't just for clothes, it's a philosophy, a way of making sure every part of your life is covered and then some. You can't leave things to chance." Peter glanced over at his children, who were now sleeping soundly by the fire, their faces flushed with warmth. "I wish I'd known. I thought quick and cheap would do it, but I see now. There's no shortcut to survival." Sam smiled faintly. "There's no shortcut to anything in this life. Just like the cabin, you can't rush preparation. If you want to survive, you build for the worst, even if you're wrong. And when you're right, you'll be glad you took the time." Peter stared into the fire, deep in thought. "You were right, Sam. This winter, it's the hardest thing I've ever faced. But if I make it through, I'll build better. I'll build like you did." Sam simply nodded, feeling the weight of the storm still outside, but knowing that he had done what was necessary. The wool layers and the warmth of his cabin had made the difference. And now, so would his lessons. As the new year began, the storm showed no signs of easing. The temperature continued to plummet, and the settlers' supplies were now dangerously low. For the past few weeks, Sam Bennett had kept to himself, focusing on keeping his own family fed and warm. Peter Johnson's family had returned to their cabin once the worst of the storm had passed, but Sam knew that they weren't out of danger yet. The harsh reality of the winter was beginning to set in for all of them. One late afternoon, Sam received an unexpected visitor. It was Jasper Callahan, the same man who had mocked Sam all through the summer for taking his time building a cabin that didn't need to be so fancy. Jasper's face was gaunt, his coat tattered and covered in frost, and his eyes were wide with exhaustion. "Sam," Jasper said, his voice hoarse, "I need your help." Sam opened the door wider, silently motioning for him to come inside. The cold followed Jasper in, biting at Sam's skin as the door closed behind him. Sam quickly stoked the fire and handed Jasper a mug of hot tea. "What happened?" Sam asked, noticing the man's hollow cheeks and the desperate look in his eyes. Jasper hesitated before speaking. "We ran out of firewood," he said. "The wind's been tearing through the walls of our cabin. We can't keep the heat in, and Evelyn, she's sick again. The children have been shivering all night, and there's nothing left to burn. I should have built it like you did, Sam. I see that now." Sam listened quietly, his mind racing with the memory of his own words to Jasper when the winter first hit. You should have listened, he thought, but he didn't say it aloud. The man in front of him needed help, not judgment. "I can't let you freeze out there, Jasper," Sam said, his voice calm but firm. "You and your family will stay here until the storm passes. I've got enough wood for the both of us. But you've got to learn something. It's not enough to just throw up a shelter and hope for the best. You need to prepare. Layering in your cabin and in your life is how you survive." Jasper nodded slowly, the weight of Sam's words sinking in. He had made his cabin too small, used poor materials, and rushed through every decision in the name of speed. But now, it wasn't just his comfort at risk, it was his family's lives. "I never understood," Jasper admitted. "I thought I could get by. I didn't know what you meant about preparing for the worst, but now I see it. If I had only built right, if I had only taken the time to think ahead." Sam sighed, his breath coming out in a cloud. "You can't undo what's been done, but you can learn from it. When the storm clears, you'll rebuild right." Jasper was silent for a moment, then met Sam's eyes. "Thank you. I'm sorry for doubting you." Sam offered a faint smile. "You're here now. That's what matters." By February, the winter of 1856 had transformed the Dakota Plains into a frozen wasteland. The wind never stopped howling, and the snow piled higher with each passing storm, making the world outside Sam Bennett's cabin nearly unrecognizable. The few settlers left in the area were running out of food and firewood, and the isolation was beginning to take its toll. Even those who had once mocked Sam's careful preparations now found themselves fighting for survival in hastily built shelters that were slowly succumbing to the cold. Sam's cabin, however, stood firm. The wool layers he wore, the double-thick walls, and the carefully sealed chinking had kept the bitter wind at bay. His firewood stores remained plentiful, thanks to his foresight and careful management. As the days grew colder, Sam found himself helping more of his neighbors, taking in those who had nowhere else to turn. One morning, a familiar face appeared at his door, Peter Johnson, looking worse for wear. His face was pale, and his eyes, once filled with hope, now held a hollow, desperate look. "Sam, it's bad," Peter said, voice shaky. "We've been out of food for days. The storm's been too much, and we can't make it any longer. I don't know what else to do." "We're freezing, Sam." Sam looked at him carefully, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the harshest part of the winter had yet to pass. But there was no time to waste. He motioned for Peter to come inside. "Stay here," Sam instructed. "I've got enough food for both of us. I'll get you warmed up, and we'll figure out the next steps." Peter followed him inside, the warmth from the fire quickly enveloping him. Sam didn't waste time. He grabbed the last of his preserved meat and bread, heating it over the fire, and soon Peter was sitting at the table, eating in silence. "Thanks, Sam," Peter mumbled, still in disbelief. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Sam didn't respond immediately, instead focusing on keeping the fire stoked. The sound of the wind outside was constant, a reminder that the battle wasn't over. "You should have prepared better," Sam said after a long pause, not unkindly. "But you can still rebuild, Peter. It's not too late to make a change." Peter looked down at his empty plate, the weight of his regret heavy in his chest. "I know. I thought it would be enough. I thought the storm wouldn't last, but I see now. I see how wrong I was." Sam nodded. "You can't rush survival. It's a slow process, building for the worst and hoping to be wrong. But if you're right, you'll be glad you took your time." The storm continued outside, but inside Sam's cabin there was warmth and shelter. Sam had built for the worst, and now, with his wool layers and thick walls, he was able to share the fruits of his labor. The worst of the winter was still ahead, but for the moment, at least, they were safe. As the weeks dragged on, the cold of the Dakota winter began to feel like an endless force of nature, unyielding and cruel. Yet, even in the most severe storms, Sam Bennett had remained steadfast, his careful planning keeping him and his visitors safe from the worst of it. His neighbors, though, were not so fortunate. Many had already given up, their cabins too inadequate to withstand the harsh, prolonged cold. The sound of the wind still howled relentlessly outside, but inside Sam's cabin the fire burned warm and steady. It was early March when Sam first noticed the subtle shift in the air. The snow, though still heavy on the ground, began to soften, the bite of the wind losing some of its sting. The sun was lingering a little longer each day, and Sam could sense that the brutal grip of the winter was starting to loosen. Still, he knew the worst was far from over. The ground was still frozen solid, and the threat of another blizzard lingered in the distance. But in his heart, Sam felt the first real stirrings of hope. Peter Johnson had returned to his cabin the week before, his family now stronger after their stay in Sam's home. The harshness of the winter had left him shaken, but Sam's advice to rebuild and think ahead had stuck with him. Peter had spent the past few weeks gathering what little firewood remained and preparing for the thaw. His family was far from safe, but they had a fighting chance now, and that was more than they had had before. Sam could hear the creaking of wood as he stoked the fire, and the occasional sound of Peter chopping wood just outside. It had become routine now, the rhythm of survival that had kept them alive for the last several months. Sam's cabin, once a solitary fortress, had become a gathering place for those who had made it through the worst. Even Jasper Callahan, who had come to Sam for help in the early weeks of the storm, had begun to rebuild his own cabin, fortified with thicker walls and better insulation. As Sam sat by the fire, the warmth from the hearth filling the room, he thought about what had brought him to this point. He thought about the hours spent selecting logs, stripping bark, and chiseling joints. He remembered the long days working alone, the endless mocking from his neighbors, and the doubt that had sometimes crept into his mind. But in the end, it had all been worth it. The storm was still fierce outside, but Sam knew the hardest part was over. The spring thaw would come soon, and with it, a new beginning. By mid-March, the weather had begun to shift for good. The deep drifts of snow began to melt, the frost receding from the earth as the sun gained strength. Sam stepped outside one morning to see the first hints of green beneath the snow, a quiet promise that, despite the suffering of the winter, life would return. The land would heal, just as the people of the prairie would. By the time the last remnants of snow had melted in late April, the land around Sam Bennett's cabin had begun to show signs of life once more. The prairie, once buried under layers of ice and snow, now stretched open, revealing patches of green grass, the earth softening as the spring thaw took hold. The cabin that had withstood the worst of the winter stood tall and unyielding, its double-thick walls holding strong, its firewood stores nearly untouched. The wool layers Sam had carefully chosen to protect himself from the cold now served as a reminder of the preparation that had saved his life and the lives of others. Sam stood on the porch one evening, looking out over the land, his eyes scanning the horizon. The bitter winds of winter had given way to warmer breezes, and the sun, which had once felt distant and cold, now bathed the land in a steady, golden light. The worst was over, and Sam knew the coming months would be focused on rebuilding not just his neighbors' homes, but also the confidence they had lost in the winter. Peter Johnson had already begun planting his fields again, his family by his side, their strength renewed by the survival they had found in Sam's cabin. Jasper Callahan, too, had returned to his own homestead, his cabin now sturdy, built with the lessons he'd learned in the cold. The wool layers Sam had introduced to them had become a symbol, not just of warmth, but of the deeper understanding that survival in the frontier wasn't about strength alone. It was about preparation, foresight, and the willingness to build for the future. The wind was quieter now, a soft breeze rustling the trees. Sam could hear the distant sound of a horse's hooves, the rattle of wagons as they returned from town, carrying supplies for the upcoming season. The harsh lessons of winter had taught them all that nothing could be taken for granted. For many, this season of renewal wouldn't be just about crops and rebuilding cabins, but about rebuilding their approach to survival itself. They had learned that each decision, from the thickness of a cabin's walls to the layers of wool that kept them warm, had the power to mean life or death. Sam's reputation had shifted from that of a foolish, slow-moving builder to that of a survivor. The lessons he had shared, whether about construction or wool layering, were now woven into the very fabric of his community. People no longer saw his careful, meticulous work as unnecessary. They saw it as essential. And as spring bloomed around him, Sam realized that, in his own quiet way, he had left a legacy not just in the physical cabin he had built, but in the survival of those who had learned to build better, to prepare better, and to never take the land for granted again. Sam smiled faintly as he watched the prairie stretch out before him, knowing that the hardest lessons of the winter were behind them, and that the promise of spring would carry them forward.